My book is titled Not Only the Things That Have Happened, and it's a novel. It's literary fiction. It's the story told in two parts of a mother and a son who are separated from each other. And it's the present tense of the novel is about 36 hours long, and it occurs simultaneously in part one and part two. And it's the story of how they came to be separated and how they went on to live their lives. On the very first page of the novel, we understand the mother has died. It's been some 3.5 decades since she gave her 4-year-old child away. So really the novel is not about the question of, when will she meet her child, how will the detective work happen, how will the child find her, or how she will find the child. It's more a question of how did she live the life she lived with the loss that she experienced. And really the larger question, of course, for me was how do any of us live with that kind of loss. And in fact, I think most people have these sorts of huge disruptions. The world is a violent place, and it's not uncommon for parents to lose their children one way or the other. I'm very interested in the institution of adoption and the role it plays in not only meeting the needs of children who are separated from their parents, but also sometimes in separating children from their parents. And to the extent to which we speak romantically, and not romantically, but romanticize this institution, we avoid some unpleasant truths about it. When people go out in times of famine and fan out into the countryside looking for mothers and children, and look for attractive children and ask the mothers to give those children up, we really have to wonder how we understand people's, the term orphan has to be questioned. And so that's part one of the novel, is the story of the woman, and the life that she lived unreels from the moment of her death, unspools. And then part two of the novel is the same 36 hours in which she dies and is buried in the life of her son, who is a grown man. It's been some 3.5 decades, and in the 36 hours we spend with him, we meet him in his life. And he is also living with an enormous loss. In many ways, what she loses is the future she had planned, as all parents do. From the moment of conception, you start planning, he will become this, and she will become that, and we will love like this, and we will relate like that, and I will buy this for her. And of course, you have a room, and rich or poor, there's 2 items of clothing, or a particular lavish nursery that you might arrange for the child. So the arrangements we make for our future that we see unfolding, what if we don't have that future? In the case of the man, he does not have access to his past for complex reasons related to how I plot the story. He is without any memory of his early childhood. He was with her for 4 years, but in the story he's lost and placed and found and placed with more than one set of families, and moves through languages, moves from Malayalam, which he speaks with his biological mother in Kerala, and moves into Hindi, and then moves into English. And each time, of course, he's losing himself. With each language he loses, because each move results in him losing the previous language. And with that loss comes the loss of memories, the loss of foundation, the loss of history. So I'm interested in questions of how we remember and forget, because that's a big part of how we construct story. As a writer, I'm not only interested in character and plot and society and culture and big ideas about all of those, but I'm also interested in how we tell stories. So in my writing, I try to have a very conscious understanding myself, and perhaps not so consciously work on the reader's mind, so that they acquire an understanding of how the story I am telling is actually a constructed reality that is then being constructed in their head. So this is the thing I enjoy most about writing, is that the reader and writer work to construct something, and it's this, the bricks of the construction are very interesting to me. My novel is in two parts because they're separated. They don't see each other ever after the moment of their parting, and I'm interested to not just, you know, symbolically represent that on the page or in plot talk about it, but in the structure of the novel, in the way in which I tell the story, to have the reader experience that disruption and that separation. So I'm not sure if I talked too long, but that's a round summary of what I'm trying to do in the novel. A lot of themes and other things also. The first page of the novel, in other words, the present tense of the novel, which begins in the first page with her death, is the 36 hours of the novel. The story of her life after she dies, which is told to us by all of the people who surround her in this very small village in Kerala, unfolds over the next 36 hours after her death. Then we essentially end almost sort of a novel in itself, and then move to a second, or the second part of the novel, which is a story apart from her story, and it is the same 36 hours. It's September 19th, 2004. I'm sorry, not September. January or February. I have a date for part one, and it's the same date in part two. And so, obviously, when she dies, it's been some 3.5 decades since she gave away the child. And so we're meeting him in that same day across the planet. He doesn't know his mother has died. He doesn't know much of anything about who he is. And this kind of hole in his life is then the exploration I do in part two. Right. I had wanted for a long time to tell the story of a mother who loses her child, and I have a couple of short stories in a previous collection of mine that really kind of do that in short story form. This is probably very much to do with the fact that I have 3 children, and from the get-go I was kind of horrified by the enormous amount of fear one's children bring into the equation, into the relationship. It is one thing to fear losing your partner, it is, or your parent, or you know, or your friend, or your job, or you know, in lesser order we have, you know, this is it is a different universe of fear. There's nothing like the fear of possessing essentially a piece of yourself that moves independently of you in the world, that is affected and impacted by history. People often talk as parents about, I can't, you know, I can't even justify bringing my child into the world as it is, and so on. It's in the 80s, for example. I remember the 70s and 80s were all about the Cold War, and it was sort of a horrifying time in which I think to have children, and yet we all go on and have children. People have children in poverty with the question mark of how they're going to feed them. It's an essential human expression, this act of creation. So as a mother, I think I had access to an enormous amount of information and thinking about this. In terms of research, I did have to read extensively into, and I did some dry reading, some sociology, some PhD dissertations that people wrote about these two societies. Particularly in the case of Kerala, I read quite a bit, because even though I'm a Malayali and I was schooled there for a couple of years and schooled in Delhi for many years at the Kerala school in Delhi, even despite that, I actually didn't know nearly enough to be able to have the confidence to tackle a novel. Of course, these dissertations are not in my novel. I should have just written a dissertation in that case. I think that the role research plays in writing is that it gives you the confidence to write what you know, but you don't know that you know, and you write to find out what you know, and you write to find out answers to the questions that you have, to satisfy the curiosity that you have. And you can't satisfy that curiosity by reading a dissertation. So you read the dissertation to give you the the confidence to engage with your own curiosity. Otherwise, it's frightening. How am I going to write a novel? What do I know about this, and so on? But it's amazing when you sit down to write. I find out that I actually know quite a lot. Writing is accessing yourself, and And I think as a reader, when I read other people's writing, it plays a similar role. It's a great engagement, the writer-book reader, this process in which we both come to this product with ourselves and leave with ourselves. The novel is titled Not Only the Things That Have Happened, because the arc is all about what happens. And here's a story of someone for whom some things have not happened. I wanted to signal that in the title, and I certainly wanted to signal that in the structure of the novel. So I did not do this as much. Now, I think we're hardwired to this. We all enjoy going up and then coming down because we live for change. I cannot be a static person. So that is something that I enjoy in writing and in reading, but I'm not as good at it as other writers. I don't see a reason to write a plot-driven novel when so many people do such a wonderful job of it, and the subject of adoption or of family or motherhood has been explored extensively in many good novels. I do feel like I have something different to say, and a way of saying it that's different, that makes my writing interesting to me. I didn't want to write somebody else's book. So I'm not a once upon a time person. I mean, time is probably one of the most interesting themes for me. So the simultaneity of these two stories, and the fact of the story having not only the things that happened, which is, without giving away a lot, I do have in both parts of the story the visions of these two characters for what never happens for them. His sense of the history he lost is actually present as a chapter in the book, and her sense of the future she never has is present as a chapter. So this is this kind of broken up narrative, which is signaled in the fragmentary nature of the title, and these fragmented lives are probably the most interesting thing about the world to me, is the way in which the world is broken up and people and their lives are broken up. And I'm not that concerned with closure because I don't see it in the world. So I don't like to wrap things up tidily. Certainly, I knew that this novel was going to be about that it was going to be about, very simply, a mother losing her child and a child growing up in a different reality than his first years had prepared him for, and then living with that break from what felt real and right to him. So the book actually has a plot. What I mean to say that when I say the plot is not as important to me is that it is there, but it is not as important, and that I'm going to spend time in my writing process thinking very hard about how can I tell this story and be aware of how I tell it. So I'm not walking into pre-existing structures for storytelling. I actually had to lay out a timeline for the 36 hours, and then I had to lay out a timeline for 40 years, and then I had to have a sense of how these timelines intersect, because in the 36 hours we find the 40 plus years. So this is done often enough, in very mechanical ways that are familiar to readers. A person sits down and has a flashback, or a person narrates a story to another character. A character talks to another character and says, well, what happened when you were, and then the story unfolds. I was less interested in doing it that way because as I said earlier, I like change, and the familiar loses meaning. It becomes too slippery. It's wonderful to read a book in which you're carried away, right? We all want to escape and do that. It is also wonderful to read a book which, stops you. It makes you, throughout the process, understand that you are with difficulty moving forward, that you are in a constructed reality, that it is essentially a story, and that there are many ways to tell the story. So built into the structure of the story is the fact that the first part is peopled with a whole lot of people, and all these people get to tell her story, which is somewhat a traditional way, someone dies, everybody tells their story. But a whole lot of stories that emerge that are dissonant, so that we still don't know who she really was and how she really lived. I also interleave these people with her dying breath. These chapters in part 1 are her last moments on the earth, which typically you don't do that in fiction. You don't kill someone and then let them talk after they die. So I sort of had to work that out as I went. And in her dying breath chapters, we get yet another version of her story. And I guess I'm very interested in the idea that there actually is no definitive version of a story. A story is just a story. And I would hate to have people just sort of skating over that truth, since that is why I wrote, and that is why, I mean, that's the pleasure I got from writing that I want the reader to have, the pleasure of being halted in their tracks, of not dealing with things that have now been leached of all meaning, of plot structures that have been leached of meaning. Let's try something different. I think that the structure of the short story was very interesting to me because it allows you to leave things out. I mean, it is short, so you can't say everything in it. And I like leaving things out so that there's all these holes in the narrative that other people can fill in, or other people can fall into. I mean, for me, often these holes are places I fall, and they're good for the reason of falling, because when you fall, you don't have control. And when you don't have control, there could be something that emerges that you didn't know about. When you're controlled, you are contained in what you already know. So short story is wonderful for that. But all forms are wonderful for different reasons. And I had a story that really needed me to sit with it for a number of years, and it needed the space and breadth of a novel, and in which the business of creating a whole or a loss or a disruption was going to have to be dealt with in a different kind of discipline. I mean, the story begged to be told in this way, and so I proceeded to write a novel. Practically speaking, I did not write a first novel because I had a sort of lack of, I mean, it's not a lack of confidence in my writing. I mean, I'm just as lacking in confidence today as in the past. Yes, I'm technically a better writer now, but that doesn't make you a better novelist. You know, it's not that a short story is a lesser form and you write it and you get some training for writing a novel. It's more the case that just economically, it was not viable for me to take 3-4 years of my life and write a novel. And I had to shelve this story that had been in my head for years and write short stories, because I wanted to write, and I knew if I spend a month writing and it's a failure and it never finds a publisher and I send it to journals here and there and no one wants it, then I learned something about the story, I learned something about myself, I also learned something about the market actually, and then I can just write another story. It was after all only a month or 2. But to take 3 or 4 years, it's a real, you know, I have kids, what am I doing with my life? And certainly around me people questioned, you know, what I was doing. So, although I had lots of support also. I'm working on another collection of short stories. It really is the form I love. If another story comes to me that demands a novel, I'll actually be very angry and upset, because 3-4 years is a long time to sit with one product. It's a huge risk to undertake. Certainly, like I said, practically speaking and economically and so on, but it's also artistically, it's the kind of risk that's risky.